Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, here you
Excellent. Um, Hello, good morning. My name's Helen Russell. I'm the head of the Social Research Division here at the ESRI, and I'm very happy to welcome you all here this morning for the launch of a new study on disability rates across the island of Ireland by my colleagues Anne Devlin, Adele Bergen, and Seamus McGuinness. The research is part of a research programme with the Shared Island Unit in the Department of Taoiseachs. And the programme has been running since 2020 and has been building a really important body of research on social and economic issues on the island of Ireland. And to date, I think this is the 17th study published. The topics covered are really wide ranging. They've covered things from childcare to productivity levels, student mobility to foreign direct investment. And I think the body of research has contributed to our understanding of the common challenges that we face on the island of Ireland. It also sheds light on some of the unique challenges we face in each jurisdiction. For example, the legacy of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and that's something that the current study calls out in terms of the numbers of individuals that have been affected um, by in terms of their health and well-being. Comparative studies of this sort are also extremely useful in spotlighting what the policy differences are and serve differences in service delivery that can shape the experiences of citizens. And I'd really like to thank the Shared Island Unit on behalf of the Institute for supporting this important research. And I'd also like to thank the members of the steering committee, past and present. So in terms of how the this morning's event is going to play out, we are going to have a presentation from the authors of the research findings. So we have Anne Devlin will present the results on behalf of our colleagues. Then we will have a discussion by our two panelists, and we are very privileged to have today Nuala Tobin from the Disability Action Northern Ireland and Damien Walls from the Independent Living Movement in Ireland. And both Nuala and Damon work together on a cross-border project for disabled people called Onside. So I think that will be really useful to hear about that collaboration. So after that, we'll have time for questions and answers. I'd encourage you as you're listening to the presentation to put your questions into the Q&A function below. So I'm going to hand over to Anne first, then to present.
That's great. Thanks so much, Helen. Morning, everybody. I will just try and get my screen shared. I'm double screening, so it always gets a bit complicated. So hopefully everybody can see that okay. And I can't see Zoom anymore, so somebody will have to shout if not. But yes, as Helen said, this is work with my colleagues Adele Bergen and Seamus McGuinness, looking at disability rates across the island of Ireland as part of the
Sorry
joint
to
research.
jump in, Anne. Sorry, but we can't see the slides actually.
Oh,
Apologies.
oh yes, I hadn't pressed share. That would help.
Now we can see them. Thank you.
Oh, that was going so well. So, where were we? Can you still see that?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Okay, thanks everybody. I must need 3 screens. So yeah, so this is a really nice piece of work to do with our colleagues in Shared Island Unit. I've been doing different bits of work on disability in Northern Ireland over the last few years, and I've been working with Nuala and Damien. And my PhD actually looked at disability rates in the north and the conflict, as Helen alluded to. So it's really nice to be now looking at this on an all-island basis as part of our Shared Island Unit research project. So in terms of policy context, I had a quick flick through the attendance list this morning. There's loads of you here, but some of this will not be news to many of you. But disability rates, as we know, are increasing in lots of developed countries as we see that rapid population aging. And really, disability-free life expectancy hasn't been keeping up with life expectancy. So people in some instances are living longer, but with health and medical issues, and sometimes really more complex and more interacting health and medical conditions. And there's a lot of literature really continuing to expand in this space. Because of this, both jurisdictions, North and South, that we look at today, are facing significant pressure on their healthcare systems, their social care systems, and also on social security systems. And that's one we've seen a lot of chat about in recent years in both the UK and in Ireland in terms of potential changes to disability-related social security policy. Despite the importance of disability rates, and like we talk about healthcare and social care, but it has lots of implications for society, we have very little data and really none at all on a north-south basis. What we do have though, so we have back in the olden days when the UK was still in the EU, we were able to look at EU data, and we found that disability rates in the UK exceeded those found in Ireland. When we look at Northern Ireland specifically, as I said, my PhD thesis looked at this, we find much higher rates of disability in the north compared to England, Scotland and Wales, and really compared to England. So on the basis of sort of putting them two bits of research together, I think it's fair to assume the difference between Ireland, North and South is likely to be quite substantial in terms of disability rates. However, we had censuses at close to the same time, post-pandemic or during the pandemic, 2021 in the North and 22 in Ireland. And the headline rates of disability coming out of that were really quite similar. And it was surprising to me just knowing what I know about disability in the North. So the headline sort of disability rate there was 22% in Ireland for those aged 20 to 69. So we're kind of thinking about working age disability here, as it can differ for children and for older people. And that compared to just 23% in Northern Ireland. So really very similar, despite that evidence that there's likely to be a big difference between the two. I'm going to touch briefly on the international literature that we cover quite extensively in the report, and this is for a couple of reasons. So there's a really well-developed international literature which finds that disability rates are complex, but there's evidence of a triangular relationship which exists between health, labour market strength, sort of as a proxy for the economy, and disability. And some studies find that actually the labour market or the business cycle or how the economy is performing is really the most significant determinant of disability rates. Disability related and other social security eligibility and generosity of those also play a role. And the reason why I sort of wanted to really touch on this today was that we get the nuance around this argument correct. I'm not going to go into detail about the different kind of models of disability, but thinking briefly of the social model, it's not necessarily just about the condition. Two people with the same health condition, one might call themselves disabled while another doesn't. And really, it's those barriers to participating in society that are important, and how each person interacts with those barriers will differ. And I think that's where the economy comes in. And I've been doing bits of work recently, and there's a lot comes up. People potentially who did work for a long time and actually their jobs have left them to be unable to work. People who have applied for loads of jobs, really keen to work, and they just feel as if they're left at the back of the queue for jobs. So when labour markets are tighter, and there was experience of this in the North post-pandemic, and it might be something Nuala and Damien can touch on, it was seen that employers were sometimes a bit more keen to look at certain programmes and projects that supported employing people with disabilities because they were having such bother filling the spaces and getting the staff they needed. So I felt it was important today to really ensure it's not an economist just telling everybody economics is the only thing that matters, but really thinking about how it interacts and those barriers to the labour market and barriers. And that's what makes an individual disabled. And really it's up to them in terms of their reporting of it. In terms of the local literature, which is a bit more straightforward, thankfully, as I said, previous work by myself and colleagues at Queen's, Declan French and Duncan McVicker, as well as Declan French and Sharon Cruz, find really a lot higher rates of disability in the North compared to England, regardless of the measure used. So looking at self-reported activity disability, work disability, as well as disability-related social security receipt. We do see in the North that the labour market, as I mentioned in the previous slide, doesn't have the impact in the North that we see in other places. The high rates of DLA receipt, and they're kind of the one that you see the headlines about in the north, at their peak in 2016 were about 11% compared to about 5%, I think, in England. And at least part of that, about a third of the difference between the north and England, is driven by exposure to the conflict here in Northern Ireland. In the south, the literature is a bit different. It tends to be more focused on the consequences of disability, of living with disability, of the outcomes for people with disability, rather than the determinants or the factors that correlate with it. So with things like, and a lot of this is by our colleagues in the Institute, but as well as organisations like the NDA. So individuals who are disabled are more likely to be in poverty, less likely to be working, things like that. It's worth noting that in both jurisdictions, the disability employment gap is pretty high compared to other countries. So the outcomes aren't great, which I suppose reinforces the need to really be examining disability rates. So this study was done using census microdata for the north and south. We examined determinants or correlations with disability, really to look at how patterns might differ across the island. And as Helen said, to see if we see the same challenges, the same things emerging, or if there are differences. And I suppose given the different health and social care systems that are in place and the social security systems, it's particularly interesting. So for Northern Ireland, not to be a bit of a nerd, we have a really, really great data set for this that's relatively new. This might be the first, if not the first, one of the very early studies that have come out of it. So it's the Census 2021 comprehensive micro data set. So we have every micro data for every respondent to the Northern Ireland census. So it's really brilliant, and then a whole host of information on them. For the South, we have a very similar data set, but it's for a 10% sample of the population. So we're still talking observations in hundreds of thousands. So it's the census longitudinal data set. But in this instance, we're not using that longitudinal. We just look at the most recent time point. So we take our census data and we begin by really a descriptive exercise of disability rates. And we do this overall and also looking at various characteristics. So looking at differences by gender, by age group, by educational attainment, things like that. We then go on to run probate regressions of the determinants of disability. Everybody will be glad to know I am not going to go into technical detail of probate regressions as we all prepare for our Easter break. But we use a probate because our dependent variable is a binary. So 1 or 0, either you report in the census as having a disability or not. And then we also split out these different levels of positive response. So we sort of look at more severe disability, and I'll talk about that a bit more as we move forward. So in terms of our disability measures, how we measure disability is really important. There's a massive literature on how we measure disability, how we define disability. And what is good about this is there has been an improvement in the comparability north and south, but they're still not perfectly aligned. So in the north, the census asks, are your day-to-day activities limited because of a health problem or disability, which has lasted or is expected to last at least 12 months? You can then answer to that no, or yes, limit it a lot or limit it a little. In the south, on the other hand, we have a question, do you have any of the following long-lasting conditions or difficulties? And then it lists them all out. Blindness or a vision impairment, deafness or a hearing impairment, a difficulty with basic physical activities, a difficulty with learning, remembering, or concentrating, a psychological or emotional condition or a mental health issue, or a difficulty with pain, breathing, or any other chronic illness or condition. So while it splits the conditions out, it's really quite all-encompassing there. And the possible answers in Ireland are yes to a great extent, yes to some extent, and no. Previously in the census for Ireland, it was just a simple yes-no answer. We didn't have them two possible positive responses. So in terms of the comparability, what we do here, we're calling this a side-by-side case study. We recognise they're not perfectly comparable. Both census data sets are accessed in safe settings, one in Belfast and the other online in the CSO, so I have to be located in the south. So there was lots of driving about during this. But we do think it's important to really just be clear about what we're doing and not doing here. So as I said, they're more comparable than they used to be in terms of that sort of breakdown in Ireland of the yes to a great extent and yes to some extent. Both include long lasting, which is really crucial to deciphering the difference between a short-term health issue or sickness and disability. Disability, by its definition, and by most of the common definitions that we would know, are long-term. Our main sort of consideration, we really sat down and tried to hash this out, was that the Irish census could potentially determine someone as disabled who might not self-report as disabled themselves if they were asked in a more direct way as they might in the Northern Ireland census. So if we just flick back, I suppose thinking about breathing, for example, a difficulty with breathing or any other chronic illness or condition, it's potential that somebody, say with asthma, which fluctuates, they have that to some extent. It's not overly impacted their life, their ability to work, their ability to get on with socialising and hobbies and so forth. So it's not necessarily going to mean they are disabled in the way that we kind of think about it. Or they may not declare themselves as disabled if asked that question directly. So we think the Irish census could potentially be a bit of an overestimate. And I say overestimate, we're not saying it's wrong, we're just mean in comparison or relative to that Northern Irish figure. We think, however, that limit it a lot, or yes, you have that condition or difficulty in Ireland to a great extent. That's more likely to imply that it's impacting your life, impacting your day-to-day activities and how you participate in society. So what we go on to do then is break that out. We talk about more severe disability, and that's what we mean by that. Those people who respond to those higher level or more limited responses within that yes category that we have in both censuses. So as I said away at the beginning, in terms of our descriptive statistics, where they're really similar for people who are 20 to 69 years of age, 22% in the south and 23% in the north. When we then go on to break this out by that severity or that greater extent or that yes limit a lot that I said, this is where we see the real difference come through. So we see disability by this measure is 11% in the north and 6% in Ireland. And to me, as I mentioned, it was about twice as high in the north compared to England. We know it's higher in the UK compared to Ireland. To me, that makes more sense from a comparative sort of angle. So we use these both going forward. We look then, as I said, at disability by various characteristics. And really, for the most part, these are kind of what we would all anticipate from the literature and from what we know. Disability increases with age. For the most part, if you look there to our first column on the left, those in Ireland who are 20 to 29 have a slightly elevated disability rate compared to those who are sort of 30 to 49. And then we see it jumping up as people get to 50 and beyond. The age gradient in the north is much more linear and straightforward. We see a big jump at 40 and then big jumps at 50 to 59 and 60 to 69. So that was quite interesting to see in terms of those descriptives. And it holds regardless that we higher bit amongst the 20 to 29-year-olds holds when we look at the severe disability, which is on the right-hand side. And again, the north is pretty linear. We then look at disability rate by education level, and disability rates tend to be much higher amongst those with lower levels of educational attainment. But again, we see here a much steeper gradient across the education levels in the north than we do in Ireland, and again by both measures. It's a lot flatter in Ireland in comparison. We go on then to map disability rates across the island. So this is using the overall rate. And a couple of things sort of jumped out to me. We see that sort of higher cluster up in the northwest, both sides of the border, and then sort of down the middle of the country and in round the southeast. Also higher levels within the cities, which is probably a reflection of sort of city levels of deprivation, and there's probably quite a bit of inequality within that. We also have lower levels in what we wouldn't tend to think of as quite rural areas over in the west, which I thought was interesting given the sort of, this isn't age standardized, given the age profiles, and also concerns about sort of rural poverty and deprivation in some of those areas. And a lot of our work recently, we've been looking at the border area in terms of seeing sort of poor social and economic outcomes, regardless of what they might be. And what we see here is not necessarily a border effect, but nearly a mirror effect in terms of those higher rates in Donegal and also in Derry. And then in places where the rates are lower, so the likes of Monaghan there, we see a mirrored lower rate in Armagh, Banbridge and Craigavon. So we move on to the econometrics. And as I said, I'm not going to go through these line by line. I don't think anybody needs that this close to a holiday. But really, some of the key things that we've seen in terms of those descriptives, we see jumping out again in terms of the econometrics. So holding once we control for other characteristics and socio-economic factors. So education, we see those lower levels of disability amongst those with higher levels of attainment, as we've seen descriptively. But we see that much more in the north than we do in Ireland. So I think really important to think about that in context of previous work that Seamus Adele and I, as well as our colleague Emer Smith, did with the Shared Island Unit, whereby there's much higher levels of educational attainment in the south, and there's also less educational inequality in the south than the north. So I think bearing that in mind within that context is important. Age is a bigger driver of disability in the north than in the south. And really, we think there's probably a range of reasons for this. The different health systems, potentially waiting lists in the north playing in, the social security systems, the weaker local labour market, although we don't see it standing out econometrically, it potentially is playing out through other angles there. And again, as we said, legacy of the conflict is more likely to affect older people, and we know has already been shown to be impacting current disability in the north. The local labour market doesn't play much of a role, which is in line with previous work for the north, but not in line with the international literature. And I thought that was kind of interesting, given we have very different health and social care systems. I don't think it would have been unreasonable to expect different impacts north and south. And as we've seen, sort of looking at the map, we don't see a strong relationship between being a border area and disability rates. But again, we could be picking that up in other places or through other characteristics. We break this out then by our various disability measures to see how that might change things. And for that sort of lower level of disability, so reporting is limited a little or to some extent, we see the regressions actually are fairly similar north and south. The differences really occur for that severe disability that we look at. And again, it sort of holds from what we've seen previously. Age really coming through in the north. In fact, when we look at the severe disability here, age doesn't have much of a relationship with being disabled to a great extent in Ireland. So I suppose something worth thinking about. Like all research, we've come up with some more questions than we're answering maybe. And then we see that education coming through really, really strongly here as well in terms of lower levels of disability as educational attainment rises. So we look then at health conditions and limitations. So as we said, we're through the list, this is really, there's differences here in terms of the comparability of this. So if we sort of thought about it less in terms of the actual results, but if we think about it in terms of ranking. So within the Northern Ireland model, physical and mobility conditions are the strongest predictors of severe disability. So they come through really strongly. In the South, we don't see any results that are just as strong, but if we think about the highest ranking or the most important one that comes through, it's the psychological, emotional or mental health conditions, which have the largest association with severe disability in Ireland, which then was interesting having thought about the conflict and the role it plays, but it also maybe partly explains that flatter age gradient we're seeing in Ireland, with mental health maybe being more, it's less likely to be impacted by age in the same way that physical or musculoskeletal conditions are going to be. So to go on to conclusions then, that feels like a whistle-stop tour of about 6 months of work. But we thought this was really important work given that sort of headline rate. And really, when we dig deeper into that data, we start to see differences emerge north and south. And as I said, we have different health and social care systems, different social security systems. So they'll all be playing a part here. So as I said, disability rates in the north and south were 22% and 23% respectively, just looking at that headline disability figure. When we look at the more severe level of disability, which will have greater implications for healthcare, social care, etc., but also we believe to be more comparable. That's where we really see that difference come through. We see that steeper age gradient in the north. We've seen it descriptively, and then it held in our econometric models. But that may reflect how people as they age are engaging with the healthcare systems or the social security systems, or that conflict effect that we spoke about. Or really, what's potentially most likely is a combination of all these different things together, really compounding. It may also point to differences in how disability is being measured, with the Irish measure maybe picking up conditions which people have had from younger ages, had for a really long time, or potentially from birth, and who may not necessarily report themselves as having a disability if they were asked directly. So I think that there's a bit of work there to really unpick that all. There's also a literature within the sort of disability space which looks at the reporting and how individuals feel willing to report as disabled or not, which looks at things like social norms, and whether they're working or not has a big impact, whether they're in receipt of social security as their main income, all of an impact on how people report. So it could be that that differs north and south. When I did the work on the north in England, I think that was potentially part of it as well. Education is a protector against disability, with that relationship being much stronger in the north. And as I said, bearing in mind those different levels of educational attainment across the border. And that can link in with lots of things. You know, education can link in with deprivation, the type of jobs people could do or did previously, which may have impacted their health status or disability status. It's going to have an impact on income, housing, area level deprivation, and all those things that are well known in the sort of social determinants of health literature. And also things like unmet needs, which is something we'll be working on more this year in the South. As I said, we didn't want to get too technical. I didn't pull this out when we looked at the tables, but the pseudo R squared is larger for our Northern Ireland models than it is for Ireland, which really means that our models, when we put in those socioeconomic characteristics, they do a better job of predicting disability in the north than they do in the south. So in the south, there's factors going on that we're not measuring with the census data. Some things might be in other data sets, but really a lot of that I spoke about, social norms, can all is really hard to capture in data. And it's kind of where that lived experience and qualitative experience comes into things. So again, worth looking at that a bit more. In saying that, and while we've said that maybe there are issues with the Irish measure, it also could be that the Irish measure, as it's more specific, could be doing a better job of measuring disability. It's hard to know sometimes what way these things might go. There's an argument in the health literature that the more specific a question is, so listing out the conditions, can make it more accurate as people respond to it. So it maybe is that disability is more random in the south, and it's just not driven by socioeconomics in the way it is in the north. And that could be due to the health and social care systems, inequality, or lots of other things. As I said, we always have more questions than we start with. And I think just there's a bit to do in terms of thinking about that census wording. And while I think that specificness about the conditions is good, updating the census wording to really reflect that social model of disability could be useful and improve information in the South on the people that policy in this space is trying to target. Other work in this space that's comparable, that 2019 report I mentioned used EU SILC data. That's something we really miss in the North following Brexit, is being in those EU data sets that were really robust, but they also were conducted more frequently, and they allowed for better cross-border comparisons. Because the island of Ireland, given the border, given that despite the different systems, otherwise our people are very similar, and really it provides an interesting sort of natural case study for those different policy landscapes that Helen spoke about at the beginning. So better data would really support that and support all that other work. So I'm going to finish there, but I'm looking forward to hearing sort of what Nuala and Damien have to say in response and bringing in some of that qualitative side of things.
Thanks very much, Anne, for a really clear presentation of those results. So yeah, I'm going to invite our two panelists now. So we're delighted to have Nuala Tobin from Disability Action Northern Ireland and Damien Walsh, who's the CEO of the Independent Living Movement Ireland. And I suppose really, maybe if we go to you, Nuala, first, if I could just ask you how the findings resonate for you and the work you're doing. Like, do the figures that Anne is presenting, do they match what you're seeing on the ground in terms of demands for services? And yes, and then maybe you'd also tell us a little bit about the cross-border collaborations that you've been involved in.
Okay, so would you like me just to go ahead and do like the 5 minute overview? Yeah, so I can proceed. So thank you, Anne and colleagues for the presentation. It's certainly, a really interesting piece of work. And for those of you who aren't aware of Disability Action, Disability Action is a disabled persons organisation, and we are formed by disabled people. So we deliver services devised for and by disabled people, which include transport, employment support, housing advice, mental health services, advocacy, policy, and we also are involved in co-production work. And as we'll talk a bit later, the on-site evolution program, of which Damien is our key partner through ILMI. So certainly from, so what we can see from the particular presentation is firstly like the similarity in disability rates. And when we're looking at things, when Anne talked about things like severe disability, we would come at that from a different perspective in terms of saying that we would see that as referring to the greater structural barriers that may exist for people in the north due to the legacy of both underfunding of public services, but also the conflict. And I'm going to move in to kind of talk about the social and human rights model of disability and how that might be useful in terms of, better understanding quantitative data or future questions that could be asked in either a qualitative or quantitative manner. The health-based definitions around disability, while they are, can provide strong indicators of measurement, they're also problematic because from a disabled person's perspective, disability is structural, caused by the barriers presented by society as opposed to medical. So the ongoing link of terminology between like long-term health conditions and disability can be problematic. From the disabled person's perspective, disability is seen as a cultural identity. And I appreciate then that this creates significant challenges in terms of how you actually measure that and quantify that in large scale data programs like a census. So in terms of kind of the definitions, north and south, the one thing that is said, the lack of addition of a time scale in the southern example is actually more aligned with the UNCRPD, in which people have more flexibility in terms of self-identifying as disabled, albeit that there is the removal of choice in terms of the question that is presented in the question that's used in the South. Obviously, there were references made around age, education, and geography. From the education perspective, I'm assuming in terms of the reading that when you talk about a protective factor, it is that education is essential in terms of removing barriers that disabled people may face in terms of access and employment and other life opportunities. And I suppose Anne had really covered some of the challenges that that there are in terms of access to education by disabled people in the north. We continue to have a significant attainment gap between disabled and non-disabled young people at GCSE, and then that extends throughout the education lifetime profile. In terms of some of the geographical stuff that Anne had pointed out, there's a very strong correlation between rates of presentations of disability and areas of deprivation in the north. So if we were to look at how Disability Action actually define and understand disability, we apply the social and human rights model of disability, which as I've kind of referred to, from our perspective, disability arises from social barriers, environmental barriers, and structural inequality. So if we're to apply it to this presentation, Northern Ireland seems to be reflective of having more disabling environments than in the South. The education structure reflects greater social inequality, and the geographical clustering reflects high rates of deprivation. But also from a human rights model perspective, we would also be encouraging people to see disability as an issue of rights and equality and to focus on issues like participation, inclusion, and accountability. And from our perspective, it'd be really interesting to see how the data that has been presented here can be used by government north and south to either promote greater investment in disability services and organizations, or similarly to ensure that there's greater accountability in delivery across health, education, etc. There's no doubt in terms of processes and data collection that stigma does continue to impact on rates of self-disclosure in data collected of this kind. All of the debates that we're seeing in the north around access to mobility, cars, and the focus on curtailing or reducing access to disability benefits does create negative attitudes towards disability and does kind of discourage people to disclose and to identify as disabled because of this kind of indication that disabled people are lazy or not trustworthy in terms of all of the emphasis around putting limitations on access to mobility services, particularly now as the debate is moving into creating distinctions between physical disability and less visible forms of disability. And I kind of moved just to look at some of the policy challenges. So from, the Northern Ireland context, there is movement towards that strategy. Many disabled people have highlighted that it doesn't go as far as what disabled people want and require within the jurisdiction, and we're kind of stuck in a place where policy is fragmented, has delayed implementation and weak accountability. And I think that is that in the southern context, there certainly is a greater focus on both policy development and implementation. So from the All Island perspective, whilst myself and Damien are involved in on-site evolution, which is a significant investment in disabled people north and south, and we'll look at ways to tackle isolation and connect disabled people to services, in partnership with the housing executive in the north and supporting communities. There is at present no sustained, dedicated all-island strategy that addresses disability. So disabled people would really welcome a shared framework for cross-border cooperation and all-Ireland working. We would welcome formal coordinated funding approaches and long-term cross-border planning. And I had a few case studies here just to highlight. I'll just maybe do two. Just in terms of a disabled person living in Derry who finds it really hard to access healthcare. They live very close, just right on the border, and they're on an incredibly long waiting list in the north. And they know that people that they know can access the services more quickly in the south, that they live only a short distance away, but they can't access them easily, and that they then become very frustrated because the lack of access to healthcare is making their daily life more difficult. And then an example of someone who lives on the north side of the border who has access to, community transport services. Um, and they can access those obviously on the northern side, but they can't if they wish to travel over the border, meaning that it really has limited impact on their access to services and experiences on an island-wide basis.
Thank you very much, Nuala. That's really useful examples there. About the transport stopping at the border. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Also, like, that point about how the policy environment generally, those discussions about disability benefits and whatever that they create or add to stigma, which can affect these reporting. So I think they're all really interesting points that you make as well about the disabling environment. So I'm going to pass over to Damien Walsh now, who will maybe give us a response from the Republic of Ireland side on whether you're seeing this similar issues, Damien.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Anne, for the invitation. Really important that we, just before I start, Independent Living Movement Ireland, ILMI, it's a national cross impairment disabled persons organisation, and our vision is in Ireland where disabled people have freedom, choice, and control over their lives to live as equals in an inclusive society. And part of our role is through our strategic values of human rights, collective empowerment, and social justice is to drive at a local, at a national level, a policy agenda to build that inclusion. And that is a really important aspect of having an informed conversation around choices to deliver services that build that inclusive society. I'm really heartened by the fact that Anne's research shows up that the definition of disability is one that needs to be discussed north and south of the border. So, like our partners in Disability Action Northern Ireland, we're driven by the social model of disability. So we're looking at how decisions are made that disable people based on attitudes, policy, structures, and it's not the impairment itself. And I can see that within the research that when we take a very medicalized approach in large surveys like a census, there is a tendency to either over or underestimate, and in likelihood, as Anne has pointed out in the data from the South, that when you take that approach around, do you feel a limitation? Is that going to be based on age? Is it going to be based on impairment? Or is it going to be based on the fact accessible transport, if you're lacking things like personal assistance services that allow you to have choice and control over your lives? So that bit's really important because how we frame a discussion or how we measure the disabling barriers is of a really important part when we're having those conversations. I think Nuala's point around the perhaps divergence on the participation of DPOs like Disability Action and ILMI in policy framing structures is important because there is good stuff happening in the south of Ireland. We've got a new national human rights strategy for disabled people. There was a good process of co-creation between ILMI and other national disabled persons organisations with the Department of Children, Disability and Equality in framing the pillars and approach of that strategy. There's quite a good bit of work around building up monitoring mechanisms that involve national disabled persons organisations. There's good work with the Central Statistics Office and the Department of Children, Disability Equality and DPOs around trying to get mechanisms that would explore things like independent living within a census forum, that how much choice and control the disabled people really have, to dig into things like, as opposed to feeling that in expressing in a census that you have something that limits your ability to do certain tasks. Well, if you've got the access to a personal assistance service, that becomes less of a barrier. It's not about whether you can do the things yourselves. It's about choosing what you want to do. And I think that's going to be really important, is that there's an open conversation around how we record data, but then really importantly, with the role of DPOs, how we're using that data to inform policy decisions relating to inclusion. And Nuala mentioned the on-site evolution project. I mean, core part of that is that the supporting and resourcing disabled people to have authentic collective spaces to inform policy decision making at a local level. So whether it's in public participation networks, housing disability steering groups, social inclusion forums, because ultimately that'll be the expression of the UNCRPD, is where disabled people are at the table collectively, reaching those decisions with policymakers. Because if we looked at, struck by the data for Donegal, a huge big landmass, I'm wondering if a large proportion of the disabling barriers there relate to access to transport, that relate to the fewer opportunities in terms of employment based on access to things like personal assistance service. Those are the bits that we really love to begin to explore. But as Nuala said, it's the investment piece that becomes really important. If we're thinking around using the data to say, well, what do we do north and south of the border? If we've got a shared vision for inclusion, I think that's the bit really importantly. And I have to recognize that politically there is that drive. We can see that. I mean, at the launch of the National Human Rights Strategy, the depth and breadth, the cabinet ministers present showed the connection that this is an issue that wants to see some level of progress and has been spoken about at a senior level. We can see it from the interaction with civil and public servants that there's a recognition that Ireland needs to do more in terms of inclusion and in terms of policy development with disabled people. We've had the historic part of decisions been made by medical professionals. We've the decisions made by policymakers in the absence of, well, there's my timer for 5 minutes. But we're now starting to see a change in that. And it's important to say that change is then met with the investment because self-organizing has a limit and a point. It requires sustained resources. We've been lucky enough to have some resources to support the development of local disabled persons organisations in a number of counties, but that needs to be sustained and grown so that when we have representation of disabled people on that cross impairment basis, they're not just bringing their own individual lived experience, whether it be to the Central Statistics Office or Department of Children and Disability Equality, Department of Social Protection, and so on, that is based on discussions that have been held collectively by disabled people to say these are our strategic priorities. And in doing so, then we're able to say then we're looking at impairment not being the issue. We're really addressing those disabling barriers that Nuala has mentioned. So I think the data that we've got there is very, very important. But I do think Anne's point about how we record or how we measure disability is something that would be really useful to have a shared island approach on, because then that would allow us, particularly in things like the Peace Funded Project on-site evolution, to say, okay, now we're beginning to identify the disabling barriers in society, because once we identify those can be removed, because that's ultimately what we're looking at, removing those barriers, that everyone will have choice and control to participate in society with the supports they need as equals. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you very much, Damien. Really important points you're making there, and especially the one around the voice of disabled people, and not only including that, but actually supporting people to take that role, to take that important role. Okay, so I'm going to go to the questions. So we've got quite a few in here, and please do add more if you want. So Nuala and Damien, if you want to jump in as well, please do. But I'll address them to the authors first. So there's a couple here around, unsurprisingly, around definitions and measurement. So one around whether the definition in the Republic of Ireland covers neurodivergence. And then there's a broader question, really, I suppose. And I don't know if there's, having listened to the conversation by our panelists, what is the best definition to use in terms of revealing the issues relevant to supporting and addressing participation in society? Is there one or other of the approaches better in that? So, Anne, I'll go to you.
Yes, and I'll start briefly, and then Nuala and Damien can come in again on that. In terms of the neurodivergence, again, as we said, it's self-reported in the census, so it depends on how people choose to pick that up or report it themselves. So it very much could be, and that also could maybe explain part of that sort of flatter age structure in the South. I mentioned mental health not having the same age gradient, but also neurodivergence is a big one where we're seeing it coming through a lot stronger due to diagnosis and so forth in younger age groups. In terms of the definition, I think they both mentioned it's really the difficulty in having, there's no perfect way of doing it. I don't think in an ideal world, from a purely research perspective, we need all the different bits and pieces. We need a really simple question that lets people entirely decide themselves if they are disabled or not. And then we need those other questions as well that maybe aren't perfect, but will allow us for better comparisons. but that's never going to be possible in a survey like the census. It would have to be in a disability specific survey. But perhaps Damien and Nuala could come in that as well.
There's another sort of linked point, I suppose, Anne, around whether people's reporting is related to you know, how they're supported, like if they're paying for healthcare services. Does that affect reporting or not? Have you any evidence on that?
Yeah, it very much could. Really, it's just a very personal decision and how people go about whether they are disabled or not. And as I said, two people with the exact same impairment, condition, limitation, however we want to call it, one could say they are disabled, one could say they aren't, one could say they are a lot or less. So it really comes down to how it all interacts for that person, how they interact with society. Maybe if they work from home, they don't see themselves as disabled. Damien and Nuala both talked about transport and those structural barriers that are in place. So how they interact with the conditions and the people themselves.
Mm-hmm. I have a question here from John Fitzgerald, who is asking about the effect of migration, citing some earlier research that showed one of the explanations for differences in mental health problems across counties was due to differential migration. So people with a disability might be less likely to move. And does that have an impact on regional differences that you find?
Yeah, absolutely. It very much could, but I suppose we're not able to look at it here. But I'm aware of that work that John mentioned there, and it very much could play a role in terms not only of mental health, but of physical health, disability, or whatever aspect that might be. People might be more inclined to stay. As we said, it's the structural barriers. Damien talked about personal assistance. They might be more inclined to stay closer to home. Recent work I've been doing on student mobility finds that young people with disabilities are more likely to go to university closer to home for all of those reasons.
Interesting. Also, a point here from Amanda Slevin, who's interested in, I suppose, the spatial analysis that you've done. And so asking, have you looked at issues in relation to shared environment? So I think she's talking here about things like you know, air pollution or other disadvantages that might, you know, be clustered within areas.
Yeah, I think that's actually brilliant, Amanda. Thank you so much. I've seen that coming through. Only now that you've said it, I wonder, does that explain some of that on the West Coast difference that we've seen, those lower rates, which maybe with deprivation and with access to services we might not have anticipated. So there could be a link there, but it's very much outside the scope of this work. But it does seem to be
maybe just call out, so she was saying there about access to blue spaces and green spaces having a positive impact. So that's what you're thinking in terms of the westerly effect.
Yes, it could definitely explain part of it. So it's a really interesting point.
And then some questions, I suppose, around some specific findings around that. One was around that differential educational effect in the two jurisdictions. And I suppose you mentioned in the study as well that there's I don't know if it was you or one of the panelists was saying that there's quite a wide education gap by disability in Northern Ireland. I think that's similar in Ireland, but maybe you could talk to that.
Yeah, Nuala spoke about that, and I think it's really important just in terms how disabled people can interact with the education system. I think educational inequality from some of our previous work is a bit worse in the north, or at least it sort of manifests kind of differently in terms of education and participation. So I think that might have a role to play there.
Okay, sorry, I'm looking down through. We still have lots here. There's
one on the conflict there.
Oh yes, sorry, that was up near the top, was it? Yes. Well, when do you expect to see the effect of the conflict to disappear, if ever?
I don't know if I should be picking my own questions, but I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So they asked there first if a third of the difference in DLA claimants between Northern England is exposure to conflict. What's the other 2/3? So those things I talked about that we can't measure essentially. So even things like deprivation isn't accounted for there. But then, as Nuala said, that the conflict in the north, as well as the underfunding and the underfunding due to need, and really just meaning that those structural barriers are potentially in place more, are probably playing a role. In terms of the expecting that exposure to the conflict to stop, I think this is really, really important. And I'm doing more work this year on the long-term impact of the conflict on social and economic outcomes. While we do see that age gradient, I think there's a huge literature in the north on the intergenerational transmission of trauma from the conflict, which means it's not necessarily going to fade away, and really points to a need for specific policy and policy interventions to be sort of conflict informed and trauma informed, not just with regards to disability, but with regards lots of areas of life in the north.
Thanks, Nuala. Nuala, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I suppose just picking up on the kind of issues around, the conflict and access to service provision. Anne has dealt with it really well there in terms of our, disability within Northern Ireland. One of the highest categories is actually mental experiences of mental distress and mental health conditions, which is linked to things like adverse childhood experiences and the ongoing legacy of the conflict. And it will take decades, if not longer, to address those challenging impacts. And we continue to have underfunding in terms of mental health services. There's a lack of parity between physical and mental health and ongoing issues. In respect of access to disability benefits, and the conflict, really being attributed to a third of that. We have very extreme health inequalities within the northern context, and that is also then linked to high rates of disability. And our society really has not adapted or developed in terms of removing barriers that disabled people face in terms of access to services and provision. And on the issue of education, like the education system within the north, there continues to be a high level of segregation of disabled and non-disabled children, and a lack of progress around how you can effectively educate children and young people together, meaning that there are multiple examples of children and young people with physical disabilities who are being educated outside of the mainstream system and then do not have access to A levels or third level education. And one of our activists in the north was the first person from a special school to access third level education. That's Joanne Sampson, and she had to really fight for that because she was being pushed towards day opportunities, and we continue to see that.
Yes, really interesting. So I think it really highlights, all of the interconnected policies that are relevant here. So we're not just talking about disability services, we're talking about health, we're talking about educational policy. I'm conscious that we're over the time limit, so there are a few more questions there. I'm sorry we didn't manage to get to them all. We will take note of them, and the full report is available to download from the ESRI website. I just would like to say a huge thank you to our two panelists and to the authors of the report. Congratulations to you all, and thanks again to the Shared Island unit for supporting the research. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Helen.